But I want to start actually by talking about embodied, because that's been on a lot of people's mind. And I think that the incident and the horrible tragedy there, I think it reveals a lot of things about the question of the police and abolition in the United States. And people know the basic deal, that there were 21 people, 19 children, who were murdered, and that the police basically stood by for 78 minutes and let it happen. And I think that, the cops there were not just completely unable, but culpably negligent and perhaps criminally responsible for the extent of the loss of life that occurred. And their cowardly cringing definitely created a controversy, even though pages in the New York Times for a couple of days were talking about how poorly the police did, and the Texas Department of Public Safety admitted that they didn't behave well. And it's a cold day in hell when the police admit they did something wrong. But this is nothing new. At Parkland, a cop named Scott Peterson waited outside for 30 minutes while the gunman inside killed 17 high school students. And a recent study in the Journal of the American Medical Association looked at mass shooting incidences and found that, quote, armed guards were not associated with significant reduction in rates of injuries. Not only that it didn't reduce the rates of injuries and death, but that the rate of deaths was 2.83 times greater in schools with an armed guard present. So that it's actually worse. And I'm not aware of a single case where the police have actually stopped a school shooting from happening in the act. And so I point this out because this really cuts to the core of the illusion of the police as being something about being able to keep people safe. Over the years, talking about the police, all types of different meetings and activists and college campus and all that, like the kind of trump card that someone often throws out, even if you convince them, okay, the police are kind of racist, they overact and all those sorts of things, but you're arguing for the need to abolish the police, the kind of trump card, or they believe the trump card they throw out. It's like, well, what about mass shootings, people with rifles and etc.? And I think that this shows that it doesn't work. And yet, the police solution, so-called solution, is the one that has hurled the remedy of the problem since Sandy Hook and probably even since Columbine. It's really been the only solution on offer. And look, surprise, not only did it not work, but the list of mass shootings has gone on these past few years at a pace that is in some real kind of academic type shit. It's stunning and frightening and numbing. And it's not just that. In Chicago, we have like an actual gun problem. Like there's a lot of shootings with folks, community violence. That's a real issue. And every year they talk about more police being added, and surprise, it's not getting better. It's actually getting worse. And in the meantime, cops are shooting down kids, like the 13-year-old that they shot who luckily survived a couple weeks ago, and folks like Anthony Alvarez and Adam Toledo, who were both also kids. Adam Toledo was 13, who were murdered by the police last year. So cops are useless cowards. So now that we've established that, I think what do? We talk about the police. And I think the basic understanding, I think people on this meeting know, is that police exist as the violent enforcement of unequal social relations. They're the monopoly on so-called legitimate violence that's welded by the ruling class to maintain and reproduce the capitalist order. In the U.S. especially, that so-called order is one that is woven in with the state ruling class project of anti-black racism. And so that's what they do. If you look at the Evolve example, what were they doing? What was all the weaponry of the police for? In researching for an article that I was writing, I looked through basically the Uvalde Police Facebook page, and like every other photograph was a trophy shot of them capturing people who were fleeing across the border. And so the function of the police in Uvalde wasn't about keeping people safe, but for the violent bordering regime that I think that Steve's going to talk a little bit afterwards. And in Chicago on the west and south sides are examples of many places in the U.S. where basically state infrastructure to deal with the symptoms of the standard racist functioning of capitalism that creates this poverty and social ills is what abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment. So there's no welfare, schools are being closed, public housing is continually stripped away, there are few jobs, but what there are is there are cops, there are a lot of them, there's Cook County Jail, which is the fourth largest in the nation, and so what the police do is they patrol, harass, and terrorize mostly black and brown folks and kill with impunity. And to put it in scale, so we're talking about mass shootings, is since 2014, 2,696 people have been killed by what are called mass shooting incidents. Since 2015, 7,411 have been killed by the police, according to the Washington Post. It's the sixth leading cause of death for young Black men. And the notion that somehow there's like strangers are out to get us is completely absurd. Granta did a study that found that most people are killed by someone they know, but a third of all killings by strangers is by the police. So if you're killed by someone you know, you have a 1 in 3 chance that person's going to be a cop. And this, again, is not new information for this audience, but I think I want to sort of focus on that, keep that as the core, and then to begin to pivot to make some arguments on what this means for socialists. And I kind of have 3 points that I want to make with my remaining time. First, the project of anti-racism and police abolition needs to be a core project of the socialist movement. And I think that shouldn't be controversial to say, but there's a political fight in the socialist movement in which the social democratic wings of the movement routinely try to dampen the centrality of this fight. So this is a political fight that we need to engage in. The people who argue to dampen the centrality of the fight, to only talk about, big demands like Medicare for all and not to talk about the police, is that what they say is that what we need to do is we need to argue for universalist demands. That's going to be the way that we're going to get the unity of the working class. Universalist demands like the Green New Deal or Medicare for all and all that sorts of things. And those, those are good reforms and reforms we could fight around, but to see that somehow as the alternative to taking up a project of fighting racism explicitly, especially anti-Black racism, and attacking the violence of the police, I think is a dead letter. Because universalist demands assumes the prior existence of like a universal working class that is class conscious right now. And that's not the case. Racism is not just a part of the ideology that divides the working class. It's one of the main reasons why the ruling class continues to reproduce it, but racism is a material project of the ruling class. Things like the New Deal, which is something that the Social Democrats often talk about. While in theory, it was supposed to be universal, the fact that it wasn't was because of not actually highlighting the need for an explicit anti-racist politics inside of it. The working class unity is forged by fighting for and arguing that the working class as a whole needs to explicitly fight around anti-racism and for the abolition of the police. The greatest advances for the working class as a whole in this country have actually happened when racism has been fought around. And here I have in mind the construction of the CIO and the union movement of the 30s and 40s, and how that was connected to explicitly tearing down Jim Crow unionism, having white and Black workers connected. And on the point of universalism, I think also like it should be noted that like, what is more universal than a movement dedicated to eradicating all forms of oppression and exploitation, ending state-sanctioned violence, replacing the police and prisons with genuine, humane, non-carceral paths for safety? Like that is as universal as you can get. So that's kind of like one of those pieces. Additionally, I think the importance of struggling against the police. So it functions to highlight the need to fight around anti-racist politics. But the other element about struggling against the police is that it politicizes the struggle for socialism and highlights the role of the state. And so this is why you see that movements against the police have such an eruptive quality. And I think in the United States, there are many examples, and that these movements against the police are also ones that overlap with anti-racist movements because of the racist dynamics of the US police system. That's how we see, the urban rebellions of the civil rights struggle erupt, how that struggle and those urban rebellions were generative to creating the queer and women's liberation movement and the fight against the Vietnam War. The Black struggle in this country has an explosive quality that always sort of puts other struggles forward because it touches at that key contradiction and that key sin at the core of US capitalism, which is anti-Black racism. And even more recently, we can see how in 2014 and 2020, the Black Lives Matter movements had this eruptive quality. This is how you get things like in 2020, when the burning of a police station in Minneapolis was more popular than both candidates for the US presidency. So these things leap forward and consciousness changes in such a rapid way because of the way in which movements against the police inject questions of power, of the state, and it politicizes those things that I would call are purely economic struggles, just fighting around how much money we allocate to jobs or those sorts of things. And this is not
10 minutes, comrades.
Perfect. And this is something that isn't just existing in the United States. If you look internationally, there's a way in which struggles against the police have this eruptive quality. The Arab Spring, it was the kind of generative things, is about a whole morass of social ills and undemocratic situations, but kind of what was the spark? And that was a movement against the police. And that sort of erupted and I think transformed not just the Middle East at that time, but I think gave birth to the Occupy movement and all these sorts of things. So waves of global struggle can actually come from fights against the police, and because how they politicize and struggle in important ways and help us to identify the target, the capitalist state, and bring simple economic struggles into the question of state, power, and violence. And so this is also why some of our social democratic so-called friends shy away from this. The parliamentary road to socialism they advocate implies that the capitalist state can be welded for our purposes and not something that is an obstacle to the struggle, that I would say it is something that needs to be overcome and overthrown in order to begin the institution of socialism. The paving stones of the parliamentary road need to be torn up and used to hurl at our class enemies. And so I think that this is one element of it. So not just rejecting universalist demands, centering the question of anti-Black racism and fighting against that and the police, but also the way in which struggles against the police politicize struggles in a really important way. And then the last point that I'll end on is that, so it's not only that socialism needs to be an abolitionist project, but all that abolitionism needs to be a socialist project. Abolitionism at its core is an anti-capitalist project. You listen to any of the major speakers and they talk about changing everything and how the system of capitalism is a problem and all these sorts of things. I think that's really good. And that is a fantastic generative movement that I think has helped propel radicalization in this country much further. And I think we have a political role as socialists that I think to talk about our vision of social change and how that both overlaps, but also can push further. And 3 examples of that is a lot of discussion in the movement is about the question of alternatives. In order to get rid of the police, we need to have an alternative. Some sort of mental health responders is one common example. So if we just create the alternatives, then people won't need the police. The police would be obsolete, is how it's articulated. We can crowd out the capitalist state by making the police obsolete. And I think that the thing here is that understanding what is the role of the police is essential, because the utility of the police for us, they're already useless, right? The utility of the police for the rulers is that of maintaining class domination, and that will never be obsolete until they're overthrown. So I think that our contribution to thinking about a revolutionary abolitionism is that if we actually want to get rid of the police and the prisons, that actually will need to take on the state. And that project needs to be one that has a revolutionary quality. If you want to get rid of the police, you got rid of capitalism and vice versa. So I'll close there. Hopefully that will sort of spark some things. And I think just thinking about how these 2 things are overlapping and mutually required. And I think that the political fight we have against social democratic tendencies in the movement are going to be an essential political fight to really center abolitionism as a socialist project and socialism as an abolitionist project.
The first thing I wanted to make mention is that I'm in no way an expert on abolitionism, which, as I understand, has a rich academic history composed of diverse perspectives. I'm just speaking here about my understanding of both that academic history and work and the abolitionist tendencies that arose from the 2020 BLM uprising that have sought to further crystallize the practice of abolitionism into a revolutionary practice, okay? But I wanted to start things off. Just wanted to say that. And following that, I want to make it clear that abolitionism is not a theory that encapsulates the rich history and experiences of anti-racist struggle in the US, and no one here should treat it as such. That history is so rich in experience that is long, complex, full of heroism and heartbreak that one single term cannot explain it. And each piece of that history must be studied thoroughly with real seriousness and vigor. I actually wanted to share a quote from Engels in a letter he wrote to a comrade in Berlin. In this letter, Engels makes mention of the practice of younger writers in Germany who use the word materialistic as a term to label and explain phenomenon without further study. Engels makes clear that for Marx's quote, "Our conception of history is above all a guide to study, not a lever for construction after the manner of the Hegelian. All history must be studied afresh, The conditions of existence of the different formations of society must be examined individually before the attempt is made to deduce from them the political, civil law, aesthetic, philosophic, religious, etc., views corresponding to them. Following this point, we should view abolitionism, particularly as an economic field of study, as a tool that helps us to understand the particular features of institutions of coercion, specifically police and prisons, and how they manifest themselves in our historical epoch. Abolitionism helps us deepen a historical understanding Marxism has about the state as a public power that consists not merely of armed man, but also of material adjuncts, prisons, and institutions of coercion of all kinds. And that's from Engels, Origin of Property, Origin of the State, Private Property, and Family. I always mix the title up, but y'all know what I'm saying. Saying that, I think it would be a serious mistake to treat abolitionism, especially the political practice of abolitionist tendencies, synonymous with revolutionary Marxism, since it lacks both a clear alternative to capitalism via a socialist revolution that establishes a planned economy organized by a worker state, the recognition of the need for a revolutionary party, the need for institutions of self-organization for the working class, especially oppressed, and the centrality of the working class and the need for working class hegemony within the social movements. While there certainly is anti-capitalist tendencies within abolitionism that seeks to develop a revolutionary practice, there are also tendencies which have a more centrist approach to abolitionism. By centrist approach, I am referring to activists and organizations who reject capitalism on principle, but still focus on getting progressive Democrats elected, or have an overemphasis on legislative reforms. I believe that these tendencies by far and away dominate the abolitionist movement. And revolutionary socialists have to politically engage with these tendencies, which include openly challenging and clashing with these reformist tendencies. Failing to do that hinders the movement in two ways. First, it elevates in an opportunistic way reformist leaders who are typically made up of petty bourgeois and privileged sectors of the especially oppressed, who are often connected to NGOs or other institutions largely funded or controlled by the Democratic Party. And here I think of the example of Black Lives Matter, the organization, which has always been a reformist organization with a reformist political perspective. And that all too often revolutionaries trying to seriously engage with the struggle against police and abolition tend to give Black Lives Matter as an organization attributes that it actually didn't have and try to emphasize its revolutionary character where it didn't have one. And it ended up that organization, the Movement for Black Lives, was an organization that in reality hindered the movement's ability to have open political debate and discussion, to come out with real revolutionary and politically independent perspectives, which is why in 2020, for all the places around the country that had demonstrations, and that was almost all of them, almost half of those places had organizations formed that wasn't associated with the local official Black Lives Matter chapter. And in fact, 10 Black Lives Matter chapters even broke with the national network over its failure to be politically independent and transparent. So I think it's really, really, really important for us to understand that part of what makes it difficult to engage in a revolutionary way in social movements is because they encapsulate multiple classes, because Black people definitely overwhelmingly are working class, but not just working class, and that those privileged elements tend to be the ones who are elevated as like natural leaders of the movement. And on that basis, bring forward reformist politics inside the movement and they do so on the basis that also like hinders the ability of the movement to have truly democratic and open discussions on politics. One of the things that really shocked me as a person who was part of like the organizing over the past 2 years coming out of BLM, out of the murder of George Floyd, was how little political discussion that actually was taking place, that was organized like within the broader movement. And so much of what was political discussions was actually pragmatic discussions about what to do next, not what are the principles that we need to build a politically independent organization, not how do we create a perspective that can help radicalize bigger layers of people to come to the conclusion not only that the police need to be abolished, but that we need a completely new system, and how we get that new system based on the collective activity of the masses, right? And so I think that in that way, we have to see it as our job to find ways to open up space within these movements, to be able to have discussions and debates that could create the foundation for a break with these reformist misleaders who, again, are often not elected as leaders, but kind of fall into it via their association with NGOs and other institutions largely funded and controlled by the Democratic Party. But that, we need to figure out ways, to create like open debate and discussion that can form democratic organizations that are politically independent of the Democrats and the NGOs that control them. And I'm going to cheat because I'm going to share an article in the chat that I wrote along with some comrades about the experience in Detroit of creating such an organization. And this is where I guess I could be a little bit more dynamic, but I'm gonna like also try to keep it short because I'd much rather let discussion happen. But Detroit Will Breathe was created simply because the movement in Detroit was guaranteed to be misled and diffused if the misleaders had their way. And that included all these radical elements who's had all this rhetoric about abolitionism and anti-capitalism, who nonetheless saw the key political activity of the movement being in the form of electing progressive Democrats. There's an abolitionist organization, in fact, in Michigan that campaigned for progressive attorney, like public attorneys or prosecutors. I mean, which is, I don't know how you're abolitionist organization endorsing prosecutors who are guaranteed to like implement the policies of the state, even if they're really progressive and they don't like lock up certain people, like they're still part of that process. And we also had people who were not willing to militantly confront the Democrats and their attempts to repress the movement. And in that regard, Detroit Will Breathe was created on the basis of turning those mass mobilizations into public assemblies where everyone could discuss and debate ideas and people. So it meant that just because you were Black didn't mean that you had authority that couldn't be challenged, because the form of misleadership, especially in Detroit, a city that is majority Black, 88%, like that's how it comes. Right? We needed to create a space where we can have debates where people can listen to what the different interests of the people speaking were and make a decision based on those discussions about how the movement itself was going to proceed. And so the demands that Detroit Will Breathe as an organization formed came out of not just that, 5 leaders putting forward a perspective, but like the actual democratic discussion within the movement in these assemblies that we created. And we're an organization that continues to exist, that continues to have a deeper, more developing anti-capitalist perspective, because we saw what we needed to do as an organization and a movement was far beyond, the activities of a single moment. That we needed to create an overall political perspective and practice that truly not only could understand where change was going to come from, but the process of creating a basis for the masses, specifically the working class, to engage in those debates and discussions and actions on their own, independent of the Democrats.
We need to remember that abolitionism of the border is as much a part of abolitionism as abolition of the police or the prisons. We need to look at the border and see that we are looking at a humanitarian crisis, and it's a crisis. It's a crisis that impacts thousands and thousands of people. People die at the border every year, and there's continuing economic or humanitarian crisis with children still being separated, still being caged, people being kept out because of Title 42 on COVID, et cetera. Surveillance for those who enter, which has really increased under the Biden administration. And we also need to situate this on an international scale. There are approximately 272 million migrants in the world today, which is 3.5% of world population. 70.8 million of those people are forcibly displaced. Now, of course, the racist and right-wing version of all this is that there is an invasion at our southern border where the white or American culture is being flooded by people who are alien, or in the racist version, are not white. So this is, in an extreme form, is the replacement theory. The idea that there's some kind of a plot to replace white people with other people. And this has been the basis of racist shootings, as we know, in Buffalo and previous periods and so forth. Bigoted nationalism overlaps with open and disguised racism. So, for example, Black immigrants make up 7.2% of the undocumented population in the US, but more than 20% of all migrants in deportation proceedings. The Democrats and Republicans share the same nationalist racist framework. They believe in the sanctity of borders, the sanctity of citizenship, and that only some people have the right to be in the US. Why is this? Because capitalist interests divide the working class on racial and national lines to make it harder for people to fight back. They want to create a cheap labor pool, and they can make this labor pool cheaper by denying the laborers of their rights. The goal is not to exclude all immigrants by far, but to cheapen and divide the labor force. Republicans and Democrats accept this overall framework because they are capitalist parties and pursue capitalist interests. On the other hand, the working class interests are the exact opposite. Driving down wages and conditions for immigrant workers lowers wages and conditions for all workers. Raising rights of immigrant workers raises their potential for better wage and working conditions. As the old labor saying goes, an injury to one really is an injury to all. We cannot have full equal rights without abolishing the border. As long as the border excludes immigrants, it takes rights away from those who cross illegally. So working class interests, and therefore the revolutionary position, is for the abolition of borders and for equal rights for all people in the US without restrictions. Immigrants actually have built the labor movement in the US over the years. There has been recently an increase in immigration enforcement. And why is this? Primarily because of the onset of neoliberalism. Get into that in a minute. Border enforcement has gone from $300 million in 1990 to $5 billion today. This echoes the rise in mass incarceration under neoliberalism. When the carrot is withdrawn, that is social programs, etc., the stick becomes more prominent. This is especially true during the crisis of neoliberalism since 2008. Carceral solutions became more prominent under neoliberalism in general, but especially with the onset of the crisis. As we remember, Obama was called the deporter-in-chief. There has been a growth of surveillance, which has doubled under Biden, and Biden has requested $57 billion for Homeland Security, which part of which is border enforcement. And the attacks on immigrants are not isolated. They're connected with all the other issues of capitalism. There's an intersection with militarism and immigration. After 9/11, this was raised sky high with the war on terror. There's a war, refugees are not being allowed in spite of its supposed support for Ukraine. The US has said it only accepts 100,000 refugees from Ukraine. Troops have been sent to the border. There's a connection of immigration to prisons, private and public detention centers. Private prisons in the US actually hold 75% of all detainees. There's an interconnection with women's rights. The replacement theory, which is directly connected with immigration, leads to an attack on abortion. The idea of the racists is that white women should have more babies and we should keep out brown and black people from the United States. And this, of course, leads to racist attacks, both physically and in general. There's an interconnection with climate, because many of the refugees are climate refugees. There's an interconnection with neoliberal strategy. Neoliberalism has destroyed or really hurt the economies of Mexico and Central America, and has driven migrants north. The effect on Mexico, just one example, by 2002, wages of all manufacturing workers in Mexico fell 14% below what they had been in 1983. This is because of the result of neoliberalism. The US recolonization of Mexico created one working class between the US and Mexico, but it's a differentiated working class with some of those workers not having full rights. The history of immigration in the United States shows that there were nearly open borders, especially for Europeans, until the late 1800s. Immigrants welcome for cheap labor and for the expansion of capitalism. Borders consolidated as capitalism itself consolidated. Before the Civil War, the US economy was a mixture of simple commodity production, slavery, and industrial capitalism. After the Civil War, industrial capitalism dominated. Though labor was needed, dominant capitalism needed to divide and control the workforce, hence the onset of immigration restrictions and especially racist immigration policies. This started with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s and then the national quota system in the 1920s. The border crossed us is a common saying. It is absolutely true. In 1848, the US stole nearly half of Mexico's territory. This in turn allowed the US to become a major world imperialist power. The attacks on immigrant rights have been resisted and continue to be. There are movements for abolition of ICE, SINs, the DACA movement, protecting dreamers, etc. However, there is a strong division in the movement. There's legislative reform and the acceptance of the overall nationalist racist work, which are just seeking exceptions. It's dominated by the Democratic Party, or the more radical demand for full immigrant rights, legalization, and opening the borders. Our strategy must be a firm position for the abolition of borders. We need to recognize that abolition is impossible under capitalism. One reason to support working class revolution. We need to carefully examine all the proposals that come up and only support those that move in the direction of abolition. We should be in favor of abolishing ICE, cutting budgets, closing detention centers, opposing deportation, etc., even though these are partial solutions. We need to oppose firmly reforms that merely reinforce the system, that is comprehensive immigration reform, etc. The idea that immigrants need to pay back taxes is ludicrous. Immigrants in the United States are a big support of things like the Social Security system. They are already paying taxes. They are already supporting the system. In fact, Mexico, Central America, and other places bear the cost of reproducing labor power and aid the U.S. economy, which means the U.S. capitalist class that gains the benefit from that, the cost to those countries. We need to take a united front approach and participate in struggles short of our demands, short of abolition, as long as they move towards abolition. We should not abstain from
That's 10 minutes.
Okay.
So-
We should not abstain from struggles that are shy of our demands, but propagandize for abolition and revolution. We need to connect immigration to all the other issues nationally and internationally. We need to have revolutionary propaganda and revolutionary organization and a united front approach. I want to finish up by just quoting from The Border Across Us by Justin Akers-Chacon, which summarizes it very well. The recent episodes of struggle against migrant repression and border walls demonstrate the power and illustrate the social forces necessary to abolish the migrant repressive apparatus, and by necessity, the system of capitalism as a whole. It will also require a convergence and reintegration of socialist politics as a guiding framework of class struggle, rooted in internationalism and concrete vision for building working class unity within and across borders. The growth of a new and generational socialist and anti-capitalist left, rooted in working class struggle and broad support for the necessity to replace capitalism with socialism, shows the possibilities of envisioning and realizing a world without borders in our lifetimes. Thank you.